feel better in themselves and probably be better people in society as well.
In terms of our what we've been talking about the relationship between consciousness and the brain, mind and brain, there's also this fact that if you're to injure a certain part of my brain, or it happens through a stroke or something like that my experience of life and of consciousness will change dramatically. And if you do it hard enough, consciousness might disappear entirely, at least any kind of self-awareness. And just given that is so much the case, what does it mean to say that consciousness is independent of the brain? Clearly, the brain is quite direct, quite involved somehow, at least in our experience of consciousness.
Yes, clearly, and I really want to be, not be confused with that. Clearly, the brain, what happens in the brain affects what happens in consciousness. And what I was saying earlier was, it was a question of whether the capacity for experience is generated by the brain. So if we disturb the brain, and particularly disturb somehow the coherence of activity, then what happens in consciousness gets affected. That is something we would expect to happen. But the interesting thing I find is almost the opposite, is what happens in the near-death experience, where there's a lot of evidence now, particularly just the last 5-10 years, since more and more people have accepted the reality of the experience, that it does actually occur. We've now, in the last 5 years, got good accounts of people who have technically died while they've been under medical supervision in hospitals, and have had themselves clear near-death experiences, which people have been able to associate with particular times, because in the near-death experience, one of the first things that happens is you tend to be out of your body and seeing what is going on in the space around you before you then leave the physical world and go through the tunnel of light, etc. And they can describe things that were happening in the operating theatre when the person was assumed to be technically dead. And there was one very remarkable case where it was an operation where they needed to actually basically switch off the brain in order to do this operation on somebody who had, I think it was some sort of growth in the brainstem, and they basically had to put the person into a controlled death, whereby they more or less switched off the brain, drained out the blood from the body, put the body into a state of hypothermia while he did this long operation. And this person had a very clear experience during the operation of the traditional thing of leaving the body and then going out and being in this field of just of light, and what feels like just infinite peace and just unbounded love. All of that, and they could describe as they left the body what the surgeon was doing. And everybody was amazed. There was no way she could have known. As far as they were concerned, they'd actually made this person as close to dead as possible that was still revivable. And so what seems to be coming here is an increasing amount of evidence that consciousness does continue. We don't know whether, what happens after the person is completely dead and buried and eaten up by worms, but certainly what we normally consider death, there can be not only a faint glimmer of consciousness, but a very clear and very, very powerful experience of consciousness going on.
So here's a question. So in these cases, like in the cardiac units that you're talking about, it seems that somebody can have an experience that includes many of the even cognitive operations, right? They can hear, process language, report back on it, process visual stimuli, etc. Okay, so which seems to suggest, as you're saying powerfully, that we don't, in some sense, need a brain, at least not a living one, to be able to have those kind of cognitive functions and experience. So if that's the case, why do you think, and we're just reaching out there here, but why do you think, why would we have developed such a complex, biologically expensive organ if it's not even required to do the functions that we normally see it as necessary for?
I don't know.
Come on.
I don't know anything really. I mean, all of this is just guesswork.
But this is one of the issues that for me, if we're really going to take that view, that you put out, which is obviously a very compelling one, it does beg the question, given what we know about evolution and its imperatives.
My own personal sort of guess is that, first of all, the consciousness kind of gets into the bigger picture again. I think what happens in life is that this thing we call I, my consciousness, is something which it grows through my life. I start off as this fertilized egg with just this tiny glimmer of consciousness, and as the egg grows and becomes a being, so this consciousness grows, and this sense of meanness comes with it, which is a whole other thing, but let's call it that for the moment, the sense of meanness and my memories and experience. And so there's this thing, if we want to call it a soul, I don't think the soul comes into the body. I think the soul is generated and grows as the body grows and matures. There's this bubble of consciousness which starts off from a point and gets richer and larger through life. And that it is influenced by the brain, and what happens in the brain influences what happens in this bubble of consciousness. And so for most of its life, it is actually dependent upon what is going on in the brain for what is happening in its experience. But then there may be a point whereby it gains enough independent existence that it can actually break free from the brain and still be able to experience the world through some more direct, whatever we want to call it, telepathic means or something, some sort of clairvoyance, which does seem to happen in individuals anyway. That ability seems to be there, this ability for clairvoyance, for telepathy, that we can pick up information directly that doesn't come through, that isn't mediated by the brain, and which we regard as rather an unusual thing in life, although most people report having had experiences of it, and some people have a lot more of it. So it's sort of a latent thing there, which is, I think, that consciousness beginning to break free of its entrainment to the brain. And maybe at death, that bubble is released from the brain.
That's cool. I like that. That's really interesting. That's actually where that was my next set of questions, because that's actually kind of the conclusion I've been starting to come to out of all this about the soul. Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think
it's something which evolves, emerges through our individual life?
Yeah, really.
And the brain is absolutely important for that. The brain is what is feeding it. The whole is feeding it the information that creates this bubble, this whirlpool of experience. And then the religious experience is actually transcending all of that and coming back to what is the essential nature of that consciousness. When that bubble has got enough, what's the word? We don't even have the words for it. Self-integrity, perhaps. That it can actually reflect upon its own nature. And it's interesting, in Indian language, they talk about death as Maha Samadhi, the great Samadhi. Samadhi, Samadhi is what we reach in meditation. One of the literal translations of Samadhi is a stilling of the mind.
Right.
They say death is Maha Samadhi.
Right.
That's the great Samadhi, the great release, the great freedom. And maybe our trainings in meditation of touching into Samadhi in life, our trainings in just breaking free from that association with senses, so that when we actually finally meet death, we can approach it consciously. And that also, I think, ties in with another aspect of the near-death experience, which is when people are in accidents. There's this thing of the life review happening very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I met a person recently when this was astounding to me. Their near-death experience was they were staying in a hotel room on the ground floor and saw this swimming pool outside, and they thought, oh, great, I'll have a swim, and changed into their swimming costume, opened the doors, ran out across the grass and dived in, only to discover there was no water in the pool.
Oh, my God.
And he said, I saw my whole life in detail go through my eyes. And you can calculate how long that took, we know from just Newton's laws of motion that it would take, what if it is 0.5 of a second to hit the bottom from the moment you dive in, or 1 second or something. We know the exact time it takes to dive in before you bang yourself on the bottom of the pool.